Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's review, we're going to be jumping into a couple of hazy IPAs, though they're not both identical. One is distinctly a West Coast hazy, and one is a standard, presumably New England style. I'll find out. They didn't specify, so I'm up in the air as to what this specific subcategory may be. Best guess, a standard New England. Nonetheless, we've got one brewer I've had beers from before, and then one that's brand new to me. So I'm very much looking forward to jumping into these. We're going to be starting today with Matchless Brewing Company's Overcontracted. This is the West Coast Hazy, 6.4% ABV on this one, based in Tumwater, Washington, and this one was brewed with a blend of 5 different hops: Centennial, Chinook, Comet, CTZ, and Galaxy. So really big high alpha acid content hops here. For number 2, first beer I've had from this brewer, this is House Brewing Company's Escape Plan, standard hazy IPA. I'll figure it out once I get into it if it has a sub-style there. 8.1% ABV on this one. They're based in Fort Worth, Texas, and this one has a very big hop bill as well. Amarillo, Centennial, Citra, Yukonot or Yukono, depending on your preference, Falconer's Flight, and Mosaic. So we've got one with 5 different hops, one with 6. Share a few commonalities in here, but I expect they're both going to be quite distinct, unique, and different. And frankly, I can't wait. It's been a while since I've jumped into a couple hazies side by side, and we're going to get things kicking off here. Matchless Brewing Company's Overcontracted that clocks in at 6.4% ABV. Okay, so jumping into the first beer of today's Hazy IPA review, we've got Matchless Brewing Company's Overcontracted. This is a West Coast hazy style, 6.4% ABV on this one. They are based in Tumwater, Washington. This one's hop bill: Centennial, Chinook, Comet, CTZ, and Galaxy. All big high alpha acid content hops. Now they also give you their malt and yeast. So malt, they use Copeland pills, some flaked barley, and some flaked oats. And then for yeast, they use juice yeast. So we've got this really kind of a classic blend here, but with a few tweaks. And this hop bill really has me excited. I expect that that's what's going to set this apart and kind of dictate its West Coast sub-style and the hazy sub-style. But let's take a peek at the label art. It's just a big old pile of hops, I mean, basically, and it really gets you in the mood for it. Green on green, I love it. Very clean design. So let's get this one cracked gently. All right, and poured right in the glass here. Oh, that's actually quite a bit lighter in appearance than I anticipated, but it's very lovely. Slow this down. This is not having a trouble forming a head at all. Hold this up. Yeah, that's definitely hazy. It's not, one of those that looks like a milkshake or just a complete juice, appearance IPA, but it's definitely hazy. That's a very hazy beer, and it's a very light, true yellow. It's a little lighter than I anticipated, but it's certainly in range, and it looks very, very nice. Honestly, when they're hazy, sometimes the color and the depth of it can get a little skewed because you're dealing with this slight occlusion that naturally appears just due to that haze. But it's in there nonetheless. Head obviously formed beautifully. I can tell you this does have a very pronounced aroma. I'm a good 1.5 feet from the edge of this glass, and I can really already start to smell those bright, fruity characters from these hops. Let's get right up over it. Oh, yeah. I mean, that just smells so fresh and bright. It absolutely does. There's a lot happening in here. There's a little bit of a citrus undertone. There's some kind of pineapple and pear-like undertones. And there's a little mix of some earthy kind of hop tones coming through, as well as some kind of resiny, the kind of pine and tarry, which is very most commonly associated with West Coast style IPA hop bills anyway. And certainly it's got some in here that are going to impart some of those characteristics. But the blend that they put in here really does smell fantastic. This head is so thick, honestly. I'm trying to agitate a little bit to encourage some more of those aromas to come up. But it's really nice. It smells great. It smells fantastic. This head is going to take its time settling. That much is clear. I'm not complaining. I got a really nice head formation and apparently retention as well poured at home. So let's just dive in, get the mess and the mustache and deal with it. That's very nice. That's a very nice IPA. Very nice indeed. Yeah, this is distinctly different from your average hazy. I see why they're going with West Coast on here, because indeed, while all of those wonderful aromas are present, that comes straight from dry hopping. But they've got a nice high alpha acid content set of hops here, and it's clear that they were not shy about adding enough in the boil to extract them, because this is noticeably more bitter than your average hazy would be. Certainly much more so than a standard New England style, far more so than a milkshake style. It shares commonalities. Obviously, they're all related, but this distinctly, I think they are categorizing right by calling this a West Coast style hazy. It's hazy, but it's got a lot more in common with the standard West Coast than it does a New England hazy, just from that hop bitter presence. Now, in terms of flavor, a similar story here. Most of what you're getting on the aroma is not being translated into the glass. This is coming from pure alpha extraction and the natural tendencies of the hops that they put in here. So in the flavor profile, yes, there is a little bit of some slight fruitiness to it, but it is absolutely dominated by foremost this nice earthy hop characteristic that's coming through very clearly. And indeed, there is still a little bit of this resinous character. So the intensity of the bitters in this is far greater than what you would find in your average hazy, to be sure. So I think they categorize this exactly right. I'm a big fan. I like all different IPAs. I am admittedly a hophead. I typically go for West styles when I'm drinking for pleasure anyway, but I drink all different types of beers and IPAs are no different. But for me, if I'm drinking a hazy, this is the type I'm going to go for if I'm just drinking for my own pleasure. It does have a much more pronounced bitter bite, which I really, really like. In terms of body and mouthfeel, this may only be 6.4% ABV, but this beer has real presence. It really, really does. I'm going to jump in and get one more sip on this one here. Just going to top that off just a bit before I sip. All right, for body and mouthfeel and flavor development, finish and balance here. The body on this is a very robust medium. The mouthfeel is very much classic IPA, but this one does have quite a bit more resistance than your average IPA. So it's got a lot more breadth to the body and a lot more resistance to the mouthfeel than I anticipated. Maybe it deviates from the norm for the ABV range, but I like it. It makes the beer feel more substantive, and I'm a big, big fan. In terms of how the flavor development actually occurs, it's this very quick brightness up front. That's where you get the first initial flavors that come through on the palate, and it is a quick burst of bright, fresh fruit. And within 1 second, that completely just nosedives out of the way, and this earthy and this resinous character starts to bloom in intensity. And it just keeps increasing for a few seconds, and it holds there, and then it starts its descent. Now, the finish on this one is not super long. I would say it's high end of average. It's not as long as some. This is not, a stone ruination. It doesn't linger, even though, yes, the bitters are far more present here, and they're far more pungent than your average hazy. It's not one of those that's oppressive to the point that it's lingering all over the palate. High end of average, maybe slightly above average, but it dissipates reasonably quickly, even on the back of the palate. I just have a slight bit of residual earthy and resinous, and it's just diminishing very, very quickly on the end. But it's very, very nice. In terms of how the mouthfeel of the finish, how it presents itself, as you would expect for this style of beer, it's nice and wet and round to the end. There's no truncated crispness to it. There's no dryness to it. It's just nice and full and wet and round to the end. In terms of balance, I really like an IPA that's balanced, leaning in the direction of hops versus malt bill. And sure, up front, And in the middle of the flavor profile here, you can most definitely pick up elements of the malt bill, but the hops are front and center. They're the star of the show. That's the way I like it, and that's certainly how it presents itself here. Overall, a very nice IPA. If you like a little hoppier IPA, but you also like hazies, this is definitely one I would recommend. I'm going to take my time sipping on this, come up my scores. When we come back, we will get to the second beer of today's Hazy IPA review. That is Martin House Brewing Company's Escape Plan. That one clocks in at 8.1% ABV. Okay, now jumping into the second beer of today's Hazy IPA review. We've got Martin House Brewing Company's Escape Plan. 8.1% ABV on this one, based out of Fort Worth, Texas. First beer I've had from them. This specific IPA, the hop bill is Amarillo, Centennial, Citra, Yukuno, or Yukonot, depending on your preferred pronunciation there. Falconer's Flight, which you don't see often at all, and Mosaic. So we have got a really big hop bill, a lot of interesting hops. Most people know some of these maybe are a bit on the outside. Maybe you're not sure about them. So I can tell you, in terms of label art, the name of the beer is written here, Escape Plan. It's kind of written in this almost cyberpunk kind of font, kind of looking scheme across the label. Then on the side of it, you've got a motorcyclist kind of looking like they're turning their handlebars to full lock there, navigating their escape. So as a motorcyclist, I'm a big fan of this. I think it's really neat. I love it. It almost looks like anime art on this can. In fact, it's one I think I might keep because I'm a big fan of this. I don't know who did the art on here. I didn't see that it said anywhere, but I love it. So nonetheless, that's the art. That's the label. That's the bill. Let's get this cracked. First beer from Martin House. Nice hazy IPA with a really interesting bill. Let's get this poured right in the glass. Okay, visually this one looks almost identical to the first beer we did. This one maybe has just a little bit more depth of an orange hue to it. But overall, it looks remarkably similar to the first beer. Sadly, I did spill a few drops on my table, but I'll live. Okay, yeah, holding it up, yeah, this is just a little bit darker than the first beer. But pretty much right in that same range. It's on the lighter side, and this one's definitely occluded just as the first one. Now, this is a little bit more hazy than the first beer, but not out of whack. It doesn't look like a glass of juice. It just looks like a really hazy IPA. So let's give it a sniff. Yeah, there's a lot of aromas coming out of here. It smells like a lot of ripe fresh fruit and some underlying classic hop characteristics that aren't fruit related. So there's a lot of this that reminds me of the first beer we had. I'm smelling a little bit of pineapple, a little bit of citrus. On this one, it's dominant a blend of grapefruit, a slight bit of orange, and a little bit of lemon. There's also some tropical fruit notes coming through. Pineapple is another one I pick up in this, but I'm also smelling kind of a mix of passion fruit and also strawberries. So it's got a very, very nice aroma to it. And behind all of that, there's very much a sense of an earthy hop back. So you get all this bright, fresh, ripe fruit mixed with this classic earthy hop aroma. It smells very, very nice. This one, the head didn't go quite as crazy, but to be fair, this is only a 12-ounce can, and this is quite a larger glass. So a taller beer does tend to do a little better. I probably should have agitated a bit more, but it did form a head. It's still got a nice creamy pad on there. We got some retention on the sides, so it's looking good. Let's jump in and give it a dive. Oh, yeah, this is another very nice beer. Okay. Oh, okay. This one gets a little more complex and a little more interesting with passing time. So up front, just as with the last one, it's very common with hazy IPAs in particular. You get up front this big, bursty, bright, fresh fruit sensation that just comes at you. And in this one, the notes that are coming through in the flavor, they don't exactly match the aroma. But, you know, dry hopping does its own thing. Then what you actually get in on the boil side in terms of what it imparts to flavor isn't necessarily going to be the same. So there's elements of this that do match the aroma, but there's a lot in here that's different. So what's coming through most in terms of kind of the fruit qualities that are coming to the table, it's really almost like a ruby red grapefruit, maybe mixed with blood orange, and there is a little bit of, there's almost like this papaya flavor in the back, and that's mixing with a very strong sense of very earthy hops. And aside from the citrus of the blood orange and the ruby red grapefruit, there's this herbaceous quality about it that is imparting this lemon flavor, but it's not like lemon fruit. It's more like lemon grass. And I don't know if it's that earthy herbaceous side to the hop characteristic that's coming through, but there's this distinct lemongrass flavor. It's a very similar flavor and aroma to lemon, which is why they call it lemongrass, but it's distinctly different. I cook with it a lot. I cook a lot of curry and Thai cuisine, and lemongrass is a pretty common ingredient there, as well as many other dishes from that part of the world. But it's distinctly different. It does still have this earthy quality about it. Very, very nice. I like what's happening here. In terms of pungency of bitters, it's got a little bit of a bitter kick up front, but this isn't one that's overtly bitter. If you're not a big fan of the most bitter IPAs, or you're just getting into the style, don't really care for the intensity of the bitters, this is definitely one to consider. It's got a lot that's happening here, and it's definitely complex, but I don't think it would put anybody off in terms of the intensity of the bitters. Tastes very nice. I'm going to jump back in for body and mouthfeel, explore this finish and balance here. The body on this one is a nice solid medium. For an 8.1%, I would almost expect the body to be a bit more robust than it is, but it doesn't feel light. It's got substance to it. The mouthfeel, though, while it does share classic IPA elements, what you expect in the mouth in terms of effervescence, the overall feel, this one, again, just as with the first, does have a lot more resistance than I anticipated. So, yet again, that's kind of helping bump up the I don't want to say a lack of body, because it's got a medium robustness to it, but I did expect the body to be a bit heavier than it is, and the mouthfeel having that extra resistance and viscosity helps to kind of counterbalance that. So it feels very nice. They go well hand in hand. In terms of how this finishes, this one, kind of similar to the first. It's maybe on the high end of average. It's not the longest finish in the world, but it also doesn't have the same level of bitter intensities to push it out. What you are left with on the very end is just this lingering slight citrusy lemongrass and kind of grapefruit and orange kind of blend mixed with a very distinct earthy hop characteristic. And it's not as pungent as on the first one. It's a little more subtle, but it does help drive out the end of the finish. Just as with the first, it's nice and wet and round and full to the end. There's no dryness, no crispness to the end. It just kind of dissipates in terms of its flavor. There's no real sensory experience there. In terms of the balance of this one, the malt bill is a little more tricky to discern in this. It's really the hops that are coming through quite clearly. The malt bill, there's an underlying sense of maltiness, but it's subtle and it's definitely light. It puts me in mind of, say, I don't know, a lighter, almost Pilsner-like malt. There's elements of it that are kind of baked good quality, but then the hops really steal the show. So for my money, and that's really what I like in an IPA, and there's all sorts of subcategories, but in an IPA, for my money still, the hop should be the star of the show. Let everything else play its part, but this is a style that's really all about the hops. It was a style that was born of hops, so really just let the hops be front and center. And this is happening here. Sure, it's not quite as bitter intense, but there's more to hops than just bitters. My personal preference aside, but I think it's a very, very nicely balanced beer. Overall, I'm liking what I'm tasting here. I liked what I experienced. I'm going to take my time, sip on this, come up with my scores. When we come back, we will get both beers ranked from top to bottom. Okay, now that we've gotten to enjoy both beers, we're going to get them ranked, starting with Matchless Brewing Company's overcontracted This was the Hazy West Coast style, 6.4% ABV. They're based in Tumwater, Washington, brewed with Centennial, Chinook, Comet, CTZ, and Galaxy hops. So starting with the aroma, this was one of those super pungent IPAs you could smell from a couple feet away. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the taste on this was fantastic. It had not only bright, fresh fruit and different types that came through in abundance, it also had classic earthy and slight pine hop flavors that came through in the mix, as well as a real nice boot full of bitters. Gave it a 9 out of 10. For the body, this was only 6.4, but this had a very, very robust body, way higher than I anticipated for the ABV. It was really nice. Gets a 10 out of 10. For the mouthfeel, this was very much classic IPA. It was indeed. Everything I expected there, but it also had a lot more viscosity and resistance to it. Yet again, much more than I anticipated for the ABV range on this IPA, and it was really nice and paired wonderfully with that big, robust body. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the finish on this was certainly above average, but I kind of expected, based on the intensity of the flavors, that it would be a little bit longer than it was. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't short, but it wasn't quite as extensive as I anticipated. It gets a 7 out of 10. Head and retention, this beer did an absolutely fantastic job poured at home. Big, lush, creamy head stuck around the whole time. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the appearance, this was textbook IPA. It's exactly what I think of when I think of an IPA in terms of color. Yes, it was hazy, but it was still right in that range. Looked just as I expected. Gets a 10 out of 10. For the balance on this beer overall I thought was fantastic. You could still taste qualities of the malt bill, which I like in an IPA, but the hops were most definitely the star of the show, and the balance of the different blend of hops they put in, as well as how much intensity of bitters came through, I really thought was very, very nice indeed. Well above average. It gets a 9 out of 10. Feeling in the intangible. Subjectively, I really like this beer. West Coast style in a hazy really makes a difference because it was far bitter than your average hazy. Though for me personally, hazy or otherwise, I still want more bitters in an IPA, especially if you're going to call it West Coast style. Sure, West Coast hazy, but let's just up the ante here. Just because it's a lower ABV doesn't mean you can't extract more alphas in the base beer. Still though, I liked it. 9 out of 10. Finally is an example of the style. As a hazy, I thought it was really, really great. Honestly, it had all the hallmarks of a hazy. Big, bold, ripe, fresh fruit, bursting flavors, but also had nice underlying hop characteristics and a lot more bitters than your average hazy. That, to me, in the grand scheme of things, was enough to put it in the top tier status. Only dock 1 point here. It gets a 9 out of 10, which brings the total score on Matchless Brewing's Overcontracted to a 93 out of 100. This is well above average. For a hazy, there aren't that many I've had that I liked as well. Well worth your time if you're a fan of hazies. Moving on to beer number 2. This is House Brewing Company's Escape Plan. Just standard hazy, no subcategory outside of the hazy itself. 8.1% ABV. They're based in Fort Worth, Texas. This one was brewed with Amarillo, Centennial, Citra, Yukono, Falconer's Flight, and Mosaic hops. So big alpha acid content hops here yet again, and some not as commonly seen. Starting with the aroma. The aroma on this beer was very big, very nice. It was above average for sure, but not exactly top tier. Gets an 8 out of 10. For the taste, I enjoyed the taste on this beer, but this is yet again where it comes back to kind of hazies versus their standard IPA counterparts. Just because it's hazy doesn't mean that it just has to be full of juicy, bursty, fruity flavors, okay? That's an old hat by now. Let's get some hops and some bitter presence in there. Outside of just the dry hopping, adding aromas and these fruity flavors, let's get some core hop flavors in there and let's extract more alphas. I mean, everybody and their brother's done hazies. They've been done to death for the last 3 years. And yeah, I like them fine, but it's still an IPA at heart. You got to have more bitters than what they're bringing to the table. Still above average though. It gets an 8 out of 10. For the body, this was 8.1 and the body was way lighter than the 6.4 we did before. It was really just middle of the road for this ABV range for the style for me, and it does get a 5 out of 10. The mouthfeel though was a different story. This had very much classic IPA feel, but it was far more resistant than the body was big. And really, it was the mouthfeel that saved it here in terms of the actual feel of the beer. It added a lot of resistance, a lot more viscosity, and that helped balance out that relatively weak body by comparison. I gave the mouthfeel a 9 out of 10. For the finish, really this beer wasn't that pungent in terms of bitters, and it showed when it came for the finish. There just wasn't enough substance there to push out the finish into really great lengths. It was high end of average. It gets a 6 out of 10. For the head and retention, this one did a pretty solid job in terms of both creating head and retaining. It was above average here. It gets a 7 out of 10. For the appearance, yet again, this was another textbook Hazy IPA. It's really exactly what I expected for the style. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. For the balance, overall, I enjoyed the balance of the beer. And I mean that in particular when I'm talking about hop profiles and the balance of that and the malt bill. Personally, I still craved more bitters in this beer, but I've come to expect this from Hazy, so I'm trying not to bash them too hard. But the balance struck between the malts and the hop characteristics was excellent. I thought it was above average. It gets a 9 out of 10. Filling in the intangible. Subjectively, I enjoyed it. This was a more hop dominant Hazy. Don't get me wrong. I know it sounds like I'm beating them both up here. I'm not. It's just the Hazy thing's been done to death. It really has. If you're going to make a Hazy, maybe go crazy and actually extract some bitters in your IPA. That is what the style's all about. So subjectively, I thought it was a step above the curve, but I wouldn't pick this over a standard IPA. Make no mistake. But for the style, it gets an 8 out of 10 from me. Finally, as an example of the style, speaking of style, this is a well-done Hazy IPA. I know it sounds like I'm always harping on Hazies, and at day's end, I am to an extent. But I kind of appreciate that they are their own animal. But for me, the baseline style of this is still an IPA. And IPAs are a style that were born out of the hops. Hops inherently are bitter. IPAs, thus, are bitter. If it's just full of bright fruit juice, it's not bringing the IPA experience to the table. It just isn't. I can make an exception for milkshake IPAs because they have the added lactose. They're typically throwing in a bunch of fruit, and it's using an IPA base and building up upon that. But it's a completely different beer drinking experience than this. This is IPA almost like one step removed. But all of those criticisms aside, for what this was definitely above average, and I rated it so. It gets an 8 out of 10 as an example of this style, which does bring the total score on Martin House Brewing's escape plan to a 78. So both of these are well above average. And yeah, certainly the hophead side of me is a bit more critical. And I do leave subjectivity into the blend, but I'm also thinking critically about what it is I'm experiencing. So there are Hazies that are far more bitter than your average. Some that are far more bitter than your average IPA. Some I've had that are even more bitter than a standard West Coast style IPA. It really is brewer to brewer. But honestly, this is becoming an old song. It's become an old hat. It's been a thing for a few years now. And the big bursty fruit and juice and all that, everybody's done it. Okay? So maybe just get back to the core. You can still have it be hazy, but let's still remember it's an IPA at heart. And it's all about the hops. So let the hops shine through, not just in aroma, let them come through in flavor, all the profiles that they bring to the table, and for God's sake, leave them in the boil long enough to extract the alphas. IPAs are bitter, they should be bitter, it's a bitter beer style. To brew without that and call it an IPA, I think is just a slap in the face to the style. But that said, both above average. One much more so than the other. But this had a lot more going for it because they were intentionally making this a West Coast style hazy, which that shouldn't have to be said. It's still an IPA. It should be bitter. And that was the really dividing major characteristic between the two. One significantly more bitter, one far less bitter. But both beers were good, both above average. And if you're a fan of hazies, I think they're both worth your time. Folks, that's today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in today. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to stay in the loop when our videos go live to YouTube, you can click the notification bell icon. It's right next to the subscribe button. Until next time, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.